Okay, I think we're at 9:05. I think we can, or 5 after the hour, I should say. I think we can get started. Well, thanks everybody for joining. Welcome to the January community meeting. As you know, it's been a while since our last one, just because of the holidays. We postponed the December meetup, or meeting. So it's good to see everybody here. We're going to do things a little bit different today. In the past, we've been doing a format where we have a guest and they talk about their experiences with Linkerd, and then we talk with a maintainer and things that they're working on. And we're going to continue to do that in future meetups. But for today, we want to do a bit of a retrospective, look back at all the work that happened in 2020 and looking forward into 2021 and what that means for Linkerd and some of the features that are coming. So I've had the pleasure of being on many of the stand-ups for planning, and so it's pretty, I know what's coming, but I'm excited to share it all with you all as well. So with that, I will share my screen and we will get into a few housekeeping items before we just get started and dive into some of the actual stuff. So the agenda today, like I just mentioned, Linkerd 2020 looking back, Linkerd 2021 looking forward. We will announce our Linkerd hero for January. This is all based off of your votes. Voting is closed, by the way. We have to close that off at 9 a.m. so that we can full tally. And then the Q&A, Stump the Maintainer. If we have time for that, we'll jump into it. But I think that with as much as we're going to cover with the looking back and looking forward, we may end up asking questions as we go along, or just get all the answers that we need. So let's carry on. In the spirit of looking back, there's our Linkerd Community Anchor program, which we started in 2020. This is for folks in the community like yourselves who are already using Linkerd, who have experience with Linkerd, and you want to share that with other folks in the community, maybe not in the Linkerd community, but in the larger cloud native community. And so we invite you to check it out at linkerd.io/community/anchor. There's a form there that you can fill out, and what you get from it, or we will help you tell your story about what you're doing with what you've done with Linkerd, what you're doing with Linkerd, and oftentimes that can turn into something like being a guest on our meetup. So check that out if you're interested. We love use community generated content. It really helps people because oftentimes people have the same questions that you do. And we see this a lot in our Linkerd Slack channel as well. So if you have an answer that can help them out and we can generate that content and put it into a blog post or something like that, that's really, really helpful for everybody. As far as looking forward, we've just announced yesterday a Linkerd user survey. So again, this is another mechanism to help us to understand how the community's using Linkerd and really what we can do to make it better. And in today's talk, we'll talk about what's coming for 2021 and some of the ideas for the roadmap. Oops, give me 1 second. There we go. We'll talk about what's coming on the roadmap, and then we'll be able to, this survey will help us to actually drive that roadmap. So if you have a moment, please fill it out, give us your feedback, and let us know how we can make Linkerd better for everybody and for you. And with that, those are the 2 housekeeping items that I had. I think we can start to jump into our retrospective, Linkerd 2020 retrospective. Some really, really awesome numbers came out of 2020, which I think as the team, as we're looking at our day-to-day and week-to-week work, it didn't register to me that we did 53 Edge releases, which is just incredible. So that's 1 per week, +1. I'm pretty sure that +1 is one of them that I botched during the deployment and it never actually got used, but that just shows how hard this team is working. And I think everybody, the maintainers, the community, just be proud of that we're we're getting these releases out there. And then we had 6 stable releases, all in the 3 major releases, 2.7, 2.8, 2.9, and then point releases after each of those. So yeah, there's been a lot of good work that happened over the year. And so again, I'm just really astonished by the Edge releases. And one of the questions that I had for Oliver is like, how important is it to get these Edge releases out? How much do they shape the development of a stable release?
I mean, we Edge releases are what's on the main branch, and so that's going to turn into a stable release eventually. And you know, the sooner that we get feedback on those, especially bug reports, it really enhances our ability to make sure that we're releasing things that work well for the community. So I think Kristen's on the call has been giving us a ton of good feedback about some of the new MTLS features, and you know, some of it we need to document better. Some of it are actually behavior changes that we may want to address before release. So that feedback mechanism is really important to making sure that you get something that's usable for you when it's stable, when it's called stable. So we really encourage you to run Edge releases in staging if at all possible.
Gotcha. And what was your takeaway from these the number of releases that we did over the year?
My arms are tired. It's a lot of work. It's I mean, we do weekly Edge releases. It's great that we're keeping that cadence up, and that's you know, we just want to make sure that what we're working on is not getting stale on a branch and not tested. So it's really important that we get these out weekly or more in this case, so that we're getting good feedback, and yeah, so the train keeps moving.
Gotcha. Yeah, you made a good point there that, again, seeing how hard this team has been working, you see these commits, you see the conversations that are going on and around design, and just how much thought folks are putting into the work and getting the releases out that was the thing that was really impressive to me. So good job to the team there, and thanks to the community for helping us to test those out. Great, so that was like the high level overview, and I really want to talk about each of the releases and how the features of each drove the features of the next one, and what that means for future releases 2.10 to 11. So we'll start with Linkerd 2.7, or the 2.7 series, which is 2.7 and 2.7.1. That was added support for external certificate issuers. I think the example that we used there, I know that the example that we used there was integrating with Cert Manager for automatic certificate rotation. And that was a question or a feature that had been requested for a while, as long as I recall. And once we added that in, I think it generated more questions about how do I do this, but the fact that we had support for it made people's lives simpler, especially with regard to rotating certificates and using their own certificates.
Yeah, and a lot of I mean, I think the theme that we'll see throughout here is kind of really focusing on the install process and making it more modular and flexible, and really trying to lean on Helm to do as much of the YAML templating work as possible. And so I think before 2.7, you know, we were kind of using Helm internally, but through these changes, we're kind of, you know, decomposing our install process into smaller chunks and really leaning on Helm templates as much as we can for this. 2.7 was a big step towards that.
Gotcha. And then another big feature of 2.7 was the proxy performance improvements. And so I don't have a ton of insight into those, but I know that you spend a lot of time you and the team spend a lot of time working on the proxy. I think going through some of the release notes, it occurred to me, I think it might be useful for folks to understand how that process works for you. Like, what did you identify as needing to be improved, and how did you pull those in?
I honestly have no idea what we did in 2.7. That was like years ago. This has been a really long year.
Yeah.
Let me let me try to look. I think a lot of the issues we were seeing were trying to pull up my release notes really quickly. A lot of the changes we're doing are around changing how the proxy deals with caching and buffering, and it's still kind of ongoing work. I think we probably see this come up again in 2.9, but really focusing on proxy's memory usage. So there are cases where the proxy could balloon because it would cache too many things and not evict them. And so really focusing on the kind of lifetime around buffering and caching is the theme of things. And then now we see lots of issues around fail-fast, and fail-fast is one of the tools that we use to limit how much the proxy buffers, and how long we retain things.
Gotcha. And how much of it, so we rely on the Rust ecosystem quite a bit. How much of the performance improvements came from underlying crates that we use from Rust?
But barely any. I mean, those crates are fairly stable, and I think when we see, I think in 2.9, we've changed to use the multi-threaded runtime. So like initially we were only using a single-threaded runtime. In 2.7 we were only using a single-threaded runtime from Tokyo, and so more recently we've been able to turn on some of the newer features from Tokyo, especially. But Hyper and Tokyo are pretty fast and efficient, and hopefully stay that way. And a lot of the things that we're dealing with are specific to the proxy and are in our code.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I do have a note on getting into the multi-threaded stuff, so we will talk about that for sure. Any other thoughts on 2.7? I know it was a long time ago, but any other thoughts on 2.7 as it was the first big release in 2020?
I think it was before the pandemic. So yeah, we're right before the pandemic really hit.
Yeah.
I'm just looking through the release notes now. What did we fix? We fixed. Oh, and we were dealing with some staleness issues around service discovery updates. And so this kind of ties into buffering and readiness, but we could get into situations where the proxy would stop processing service discovery updates, and we fixed a bunch of that stuff. So this is, yeah, mostly internal changes to the buffering strategy in 2.7.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay, let's move on to 2.8, which there was much fanfare that came out with this release, as it was the support for multi-cluster, which that was one of the things that I had heard people asking about early on when I started working in the Linkerd community, is does it support multiple clusters? And a lot of our internal conversations were around, like, what does it mean to support multiple clusters? And so it was, again, interesting for me to see that process of how you talk about taking a statement like, I want multi-cluster support, and turning that into a design that works, and the amount of work that goes into that, and facing some of those challenges and talking about the trade-offs. So I mentioned those things because I think it's important for the community to understand that there is, again, a ton of work that goes into these things. And so I continue to be impressed by the efficiency with which it happens on the Linkerd community. So yeah, what were your initial thoughts on the design for multi-cluster? It seemed pretty simple afterwards with just the two components, the gateway and the service mirror. Were there other designs that you thought may have worked as well?
No, I mean, the basic layout of importing service, leaning on the Kubernetes API to import service objects and manage endpoints manually via controllers, one we're pretty happy with. We've continued to iterate on the implementation details of this quite a bit. And so initially there's only one service mirror per cluster, and it would talk to multiple clusters and have to have all the authentication for all those things. And now we've made them kind of more piecemeal, so that this is, I think, going into 2.9 and 2.10, so that each mirror is responsible for only one target cluster. And going into 2.10, we'll do TCP as well. So, I mean, it's really the Linkerd story of lean on Kubernetes as hard as we can, get down a core set of features that work well, and then incrementally add features on top of that. And so this is a nice first big step in that direction.
Yeah, yeah, and hearing the conversations about how it's iterating and evolving, I can see that those simple steps at the very beginning make it more flexible, more agile to build on top of those already existing Kubernetes APIs and add support or make the multi-cluster support more robust. So excited to see, well, I know that there are a number of people in GitHub and Slack who've been asking about multi-cluster TCP support. So excited to see that one come out. And so then we started talking about the add-on concepts, and this one took me a minute to get. I know that Tarun spent a lot of time working on this and I think designing it even. And that's had its own iteration and its own evolution. Where did the idea for add-ons come from, and how did it become like a structural thing?
Yeah, this is really about changing the install process, right? And so initially we had like one big template and it would just get, rendered into the whole control plane. And so we started to get questions around like, well, I want to use my own Prometheus, or, and then when we were adding things like Jaeger and Open Census, those were never on by default, right? We don't want to ship those things on by default. Because one, they don't provide a lot of value unless you change your application, and two, they're just, it's performance overhead and cost overhead to those things. And so we started going down the path of like, how do we make the install more modular, where we have these kind of optional components, especially starting with Jaeger and Open Census. And so, we'll see that work continue through 2.9 and 2.10 as well. And this, I think we've changed the approach a bit over time, but it's still kind of based on the same goals of how do we split apart our massive YAML into smaller YAMLs.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's. I think I have a note on 2.9 or 2.10 to talk about extensions, which is what I believe add-ons have iterated into, and it sounds pretty powerful, and it'll be interesting to see how folks in the community use that. Off the top of my head, if you like, what would be a good extension, good simple extension that you think somebody could build? I'll put you on the spot here with the.
I don't know.
Like, yeah.
Istio plugin.
No, that doesn't make sense.
Okay. Yeah. Well, as we continue to develop the structure for extensions, and I'm sure there will be documentation for it as well, so that folks in the community can develop their own extensions for whatever integrations that they might have with their Linkerd environments. So awesome. Any other thoughts on 2.8? Those were my two main talking points for that release.
I think that's about right.
Okay. Yeah. All right, and then 2.9, the most recent release. This came out in November, and so one of the questions that I wanted to ask you about, and I pose this question because I think it helps developers, it helps the community in general. So if we look at the dates for release between 2.8 and 2.9, it was like June 9th, I think 2.8 was released, and November 10th or 20th, 2.9 was released. And in that time, you tweeted, you said, "I'm bad at estimating software projects," and you got a lot of supportive feedback in that tweet. What was like? Were you actually feeling bad at the moment, or were you just like, where did that come from, and what advice would you offer to other folks who feel like their project has taken too long?
It's, yeah, I think, I mean, these are kind of, I do a lot of my work on the proxy side of things, and these changes do tend to be lots of refactors, right? And so we're not kind of dealing with a really static system there. And as we get into them, we can like find out like, oh, to change this one thing that seemed like it would be simple, we actually have to go change these other things. And I think we tend not to do a ton of upfront design. Like we have a pretty loose idea for what the feature is and how our approach to it's going to be. But we really end up getting into, as a as a professor of mine said, like until you've written code, you're just talking. And so it's a lot easier on paper a lot of times. And then once we get into the implementations, we find out there's all sorts of details and bug fixes that we need to do. And so, I think it's very real stress when we get into the crunch time with these things. And it's been on like 3 or 4 months, and people are waiting for bug fixes that are going to be available in the new stable, but we're like still trying to get these features done. And so, we're getting better, I think, at managing some of that, but it still can be difficult, especially getting into these bigger changes. And the MTLS changes have certainly been involved, but good for the most part.
Gotcha. And I'll call back to, I think it was 2 meetups ago where you had said you do some of your best thinking in the shower. So I assume that around that time you were very clean, doing a lot of thinking.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned, well, mutual TLS for all TCP traffic is the banner feature for 2.9. It's something that, again, folks in the community have been asking for. I know that I've asked you questions about it before in meetups, and like I think the hardest one is like, what makes it difficult to TLS TCP traffic? Why is HTTP traffic easier for MTLS and TCP traffic more difficult?
Well, with HTTP, the proxy's been set up for HTTP load balancing, things like that for a while, right? And so a lot of our core features were kind of assumed around HTTP. When you're dealing with load balancing, like the TLS negotiation is an endpoint level thing, not a service level thing. And so before 2.9, we would simply just forward GCP traffic to kube proxy or whatever, and we would not do any discovery in that step. So with 2.9, we started doing discovery for every TCP connection or every unique endpoint that you're talking to. And so that really required changing a lot of the discovery mechanisms and pulling it up to be much earlier in the connection's lifetime. But what this means is that now we're doing most of our discovery can be done once per connection instead of once per request. And so we've been trying to pull out lots of these things that were happening per request, all of these kind of lookups. Not that we're doing network calls per request, all of it's cached, but a lot of the processing that was happening per request, we're now doing once per connection instead. And so it's really that change of both doing that for TCP, but also making these changes work for the HTTP stack so that we can, for instance, we look up service profiles now once per connection, and then based on that, we determine whether we have to go do load balancing, whether we should just do TCP forwarding, what have you. And so, it's really just those restructuring to really support a new discovery scheme is the bulk of the changes. The actual TLS part of it's pretty boring and uninteresting. But
gotcha. That's old hat stuff.
Well, there's just not a lot of work there. All the work is in changing how we do discovery and load balancing so that we can set up to do TCP or TLS, but the TLS functionality barely changed in the release.
Gotcha. And so when we're talking about 2.7 proxy improvements, you mentioned the multi-core proxy runtime. And this is something that I haven't heard too many people talking about in either Linkerd Slack or in GitHub. So if you were, can you describe it to us and tell us like what use cases would you recommend for it?
So with before 2.9, we were on we depend heavily on Tokyo. Tokyo is an asynchronous runtime in Rust. And if you're familiar with the Java ecosystem, it's like Netty or Python Twisted or whatever. There's probably newer things in Python than Twisted, but it gives you this kind of asynchronous networking programming model. And we started with the single-threaded runtime because it was better tested and less complex. And we wanted to limit the proxy's resources to be really minimal. And so it only used up to a single core, and you couldn't make the proxy use more than a core if you wanted to. But since we started on this, years ago, we had been actually funding Carl to work on, one of the Tokyo maintainers, to work on things like the multi-threaded runtime. And that really kind of got production ready over the past year. And so in 2.9, we adopted the change, which was really about upgrading Tokyo to, I think, the O2 release at the time. And with that was a kind of big revision of the APIs. And we enabled support for this. And so the way it works in the proxy is if the proxy only has a single core allocated to it via CPU limits, we won't use the multi-threaded runtime. But if the proxy has access to more than one core, we'll spin up a thread per core, and that means that we can do higher traffic processing for things like ingresses or highly concurrent things. And so I think there's been some issues where folks used to say like, oh, I can get up to 10K RPS, but like after that, the proxy kind of backs up. And we've theoretically removed all those bottlenecks by adding multi-threaded capacity. And so a lot of the work we were doing in 2.9 was around load testing and trying to eliminate any kind of bottlenecks that would prevent those high concurrence use cases.
Gotcha. Okay, so that goes back, like you said, relies on the Tokyo crate, which has multi-threadedness built into it. And so once that was stable, we were able to bring it into the Linkerd proxy. Gotcha. Great. And then one of the other features of 2.9, one that's near and dear to my heart because it was part of our GSOC project, Google Summer of Code project with Ali Arif, he presented that at one of our meetings here, was ARM support. And I know that this is, when I first started looking at the Linkerd repository, probably 2 or 2.5 years ago, Linkerd 2 repository, this was one of the longer standing issues. And so it's nice to see that get through. How important do you see that being in the future?
Sorry, repeat the question.
How important do you see ARM support being in the future?
ARM support. Yeah. So I mean, we keep seeing the slow march to ARM. The Apple now is of course doing laptops in ARM, and I guess Microsoft as well. And the new infrastructure in Amazon, for instance, is much cheaper to run on ARM. So I think it seems like an obvious decision, and it was not. I think there was a lot of changes to our release process that had to happen, but there was really very little code change, or if any, that we had to do to support it. It was really just changing our builds to, for instance, use the multi-arch Docker images and to do cross-compiling for the proxy and a bunch of the Go components. And so we're at a much better place because of it. We're like using all the modern Docker build kit stuff, which is great. And certainly the work there was really important to that. So yeah, we're excited about it. There's still some, I think, questions about how widely it's deployed. I don't have any insight into how much folks are using it, but it's definitely exciting to enable those use cases.
Yeah, it is. I know that there's one user in particular, probably more than a year ago, who they were talking about deploying clusters for IoT devices, like within warehouses on Raspberry Pis. And so I think that they would appreciate this support. I haven't chatted with them recently about it though. So good. Yeah, I'm excited about that one as well. So 2.7, 2.8, 2.9, those were our big stable releases for 2020. Any other thoughts about the releases or about looking back over the year? Anything you would have changed, done differently, or is this everything's on the right path for setting us up for 2021?
I would have typed faster. And I think we'll probably expect to see a 2.9.3 in the next week or two. There's one issue with upgrading from 2.8 to 2.9 where certain requests will fail if you're running 2.8 and 2.9 together. So we'll get a fix out that at least enables a clean upgrade to 2.9 before we get 2.10 out, because we expect you to do upgrades through each major version. You can't jump directly from 2.8 to 2.10 without unexpected things happening. So yeah, I think we'll get another stability release out, and then on to 2.10, hopefully next month sometime.
And we can all hold you to that.
Hopefully, I said.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Good. Okay. Well, speaking of the future, let's talk about 2021. You just mentioned,
Charles, I have a quick question, which is that
Yeah.
2.9.3 release expected to have anything in it besides the compatibility fix for 2.8 upgrades?
I think I'd have to look at my GitHub issues, but I think there was one other issue around. Oh, let me find it really quick. I think there's one other issue around cert management, and that might be fixable, but it's really a question of how hard the backport is. And so if we've changed lots of part of that code since the fix, it might be harder to backport some of this stuff because we don't want to pull in a bunch of the other changes as part of it. So it's kind of tactical around what's easy to backport onto the 2.9 branch.
Cool. Okay, so 2.10 next February, or this February, we're talking about a modular extension system as the main feature. And if my understanding is correct, this is the extension model that add-ons turned into. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. And so with this, Linkerd install will no longer give you Prometheus, web, tap, all of the things that you use to kind of visualize the cluster. What Linkerd install will give you is primarily the core control plane of service discovery for load balancing, service profiles, and things like that, identity for MTLS, and the proxy injector, which configures the proxy on your pods. And that's it. And so we really want to have a kind of minimal core control plane that you have to focus on for operation. And then when you get into fancy things like, oh, I want Viz or multi-cluster in Jaeger, there's a set of other namespaces you can add. And so multi-cluster was actually kind of implemented this way to begin with, which was maybe lucky, maybe we're just really have a lot of foresight. And we want to, I think we keep getting feedback around Prometheus being a heavyweight component. And so we've made that optional, but even more than that, like the web components should be optional. Like if you're standing up a cluster on your Raspberry Pi, you shouldn't have to be running all of these components just to get kind of the core connectivity for routing in there. And so we want to make it a little bit more a choose your own adventure to some degree. But I think the other goal is really focusing on making that core control plane really locked down and boring and over time, right? We want that core control plane to change much less, and you'd be able to iterate on the extensions a lot more. I guess one of the other big changes with that, at least right now, I think there's still some, we're still in the realm of doing a lot of testing, is that we're moving to a multi-webhook model. And so the proxy injector right now configures things like tap and configures things like Jaeger, and there's no multi-cluster concerns in there. But that means that that proxy injector would have to know about all the extensions, possible configurations. And so we've torn that out of the proxy injector, which now just adds the proxy. And there's a Jaeger injector, which will, once it sees the proxy injected, if it's there, can add the open census configuration to the proxy. And the tap injector, if you've enabled it, will add the tap configuration to the proxy. And so we want these things to be a lot more decoupled so that if you want to modify proxy configuration, those can all happen through external webhooks. And ultimately, maybe that means that these things can deliver runtime plugins to the proxy. We're not starting there, but we don't want all of those concerns to have to be in the core control plane in terms of just getting the proxy sidecar added. And with 2.10, we're going to be, I think, a little bit conservative about doing that release. So that's why I say hopefully in February. But we really want to take some time once we hit feature complete, not just get the release out immediately, but do a little bit more internal iteration. And hopefully you all give us good bug reports and feedback before we get to stable so that once 2 turns out, we can do a bit less support and a bit more focusing on the next set of feature work that we want to do.
Gotcha. So minimal control plane, making it more extensible. Can you, so if it's my understanding that Viz will contain TAP and the dashboard, the web piece, and Prometheus and Grafana. Is it those 4 pieces that are in Viz?
Yep, and things like the stat command, for instance, depend on Prometheus. And so, okay, so a lot of sorry, there we go. Rewind. Repeat the question. Sorry, I lost my train.
We were talking about Viz, like what's going to be in Viz. You said.
Oh yes. Yeah. So there's a
Prometheus.
Yes, there's a metrics API there as well. So like Linkerd edges depends on Prometheus, and so we'll see some of the kind of CLI functionality. Won't work unless you have the Viz extension.
Gotcha. I lost my train of thought a little bit there too, but so overall, the modular, these extensions are going to be webhook driven, and will there be some sort of, I hate to say like SDK or API, but if I do want to create my own extension, will it be well defined what I need to create in order to build that?
Probably not off the bat. I don't think there is a super general thing like the writing a webhook is kind of a known quantity, and I don't know that Linkerd can provide a ton of value there as a project. But we may find that there's kind of common library components that make it easier to write these things. But I think that'll be a little bit more incremental. So before we like define a standard and try to figure out what it means to be an extension, how you write one, the system is pretty going to be pretty basic, where it's a label annotation on namespaces defines what an extension is. So we can do a query like Linkerd check, for instance. We'll be able to query the cluster and say, here are the extensions installed because I know these namespaces exist with this annotation, with this label. And then we'll probably have some holes in the CLI. For instance, like if you have like a linkerd-foo CLI in your path, then we'll be able to kind of treat that as an extension if you have a foo extension installed in the cluster. And so I think there's some incremental steps, but it won't be really a generalized thing. But if you have ideas of things that would maybe make sense as Linkerd extensions, I'd be happy to chat and figure out how to make that happen.
Awesome. Okay, so MTLS support for all TCP traffic. My understanding of the core of how Linkerd does MTLS for any kind of traffic is through the protocol detection. And so before 2.9, we were doing protocol detection to determine whether traffic was HTTP or TCP traffic. And I'm probably oversimplifying this, but now for 2.10, we're adding this notion of opaque ports. So you've got traffic, which Linkerd will just handle on its own, which is how Linkerd has worked for a long time. And then we have skip inbound and skip outbound ports, which is traffic you configure Linkerd to ignore. And now we've got this opaque traffic, which is you're configuring the proxy to just pass this through. Don't try to do anything with it. Don't try to detect it. Just send it on its way and collect your TCP level metrics. Is that and secure it with MTLS?
Yeah. So the issue with like if the proxy gets a connection on a port that is like, let's say 3306 is MySQL. If a proxy gets a connection on port 3306, it can't actually try to do TLS on that port, right? Because the server is going to speak first, and we can't know whether the client's going to do TLS before we try to do anything with the socket. And so what we've done instead is we've created this thing called a transport header. And so this allows us to send, like, basically you annotate your workload to say, well, on 3306, I am opaque. You have to forward this as normal TCP. And when a proxy wants to communicate with that pod, Service Discovery says, hey, port 3306 that you're trying to connect to, it has a proxy, but you can't actually, that's an opaque port. We can't do any MTLS on that port. So the proxy instead, and then the service discovery says to the proxy, but the Linkerd proxy is running there and it's listening on 4143, which is the inbound port. And so then the outbound proxy says, okay, I'll connect to 4143 and I'll do TLS on that. And I'll add a little bit of data to the beginning of the connection, what we call a transport header. And that transport header says, okay, inbound proxy, you're actually connecting to 3306. And so once we terminate TLS, we read the transport header and we can actually forward those TCP connections to the original destination, having done this kind of dance. And that same mechanism is how we're going to be doing TCP multi-cluster. So the gateway will accept connections, expect this transport header, and then use that header to determine how to forward traffic internally in the cluster. So the multi-cluster part of that's still in flight, but the general opaque ports functionality should work on the latest edges.
Yep, awesome. I've actually played with it a bit. So thanks for that very much more technical explanation than I could ever do. So good. I think that's exciting. And I'm kidding about forcing or holding your feet to the fire for release in February, of course. I think the whole community is excited to have it when it comes out. I know that I've chatted with folks in Linkerd Slack who are already testing opaque ports where they can, and the folks who can't just yet are looking forward to it. So keep up the good work there to you and to the whole team.
Is there anything that the community can do to help with this release?
Again, testing edges is really important. Filing bugs on edges with repros is really important. And so yeah, anything that we can do to, I think Kristen, who's on the call, has they found some issues with RabbitMQ, some changes since the last since 2.9, and so those issues have been really helpful. We're going to investigate whether we should just document that opaque ports is the right way to handle this, or change some of the changes, revert some of the changes that we've done since 2.9. But yeah, getting good concrete issues written, and ultimately getting integration tests for anything, helping us add integration tests for the types of things that you find is super valuable. So we really appreciate that work.
So if you want this release to happen sooner, you got to do some work.
If you want it to happen without bugs, especially, then
I don't know if we make that guarantee.
Well, if you want to upgrade to 2.10 to get this functionality, then I really encourage you to try it before the stable happens, so that you have something that works for you once you're ready to upgrade. And a lot of those things that you'll find are we haven't documented certain things yet, and so that's really helpful to tell us what we really need to make sure we cover docs-wise before the release goes out.
Awesome. Okay, let's move on to 2.11. We see here that we've just got one feature planned for 2.11, and I think this kind of speaks to the roadmap in general. So will you tell us what policy is?
So there's probably more than just that one thing going in, but the big theme that we want to target for 2.11 is really doubling or extending our MTLS model. So the plan has always been that we need to get MTLS between everything, so that we can start to do policy based on those things. And so we not using policy based on IPs and having big lists of IPs, but actually using service accounts to tie authorization policy of who can talk to what. But not just authorization policy. I think there's other things that we can hang off of there, like retry policies and timeout policies and rate limiting policies and all those sorts of features that today are kind of centered around service profiles. But service profiles are right now very HTTP specific, and also I don't think they were something we did very early in the project. I think back when maybe it's one of its very first releases of the conduit. And since then we've figured out kind of where we've made some misjudgments about it. Some of the APIs that we don't really like and don't feel particularly Kubernetes focused. So I would love to figure out how we deprecate service profiles and replace them with something that's a little bit more forward looking. So we'll be looking at things like the SMI traffic policies. I don't know if we're going to adopt them whole hog or whether we just take inspiration from them and try to work with those communities to revise them. There'll probably be I think whatever we do, we'll plan to have adapters that allow SMI to be satisfied by Linkerd, but it may not be the core APIs that we start with, really depending on how that design process goes. So I was hoping that would be a little further in design at this point, but software takes longer than you'd hope. So we'll probably get in design for this over the next couple of weeks.
So this will be our third CRD.
I'm not. There might be more than one. I'm not making any promises about.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think the plan. I'd expect there to be more than one CRD, and I think we'll probably start deprecating service profiles and provide tooling to move those to something else. But I think we have to get deeper into the details to figure out what exactly is going to be in 2.11. I would hope service level authorization though is a thing that we ship there.
Awesome. Well, all those things that you mentioned are things that I've heard people asking about, especially the rate limiting one. So excited to see what comes from design, and if folks have input on the design, what's the right way to do that? Is that through discussion and feature request? Or sorry, not input on design, but input on what they want to see feature-wise.
Yeah, I mean, I think getting issues with really concrete use cases is really helpful. It's less helpful to say, solve the problem this way, and more helpful to really tell us what problems you're trying to solve and how you think about them. Okay. Because we're trying to make this fit several use cases generally, and to kind of fit into a kind of, like I said, a framework to move a lot of these things forward. So yeah, I think starting with how you want to configure things and what problems you're solving is really helpful to get into GitHub issues.
Gotcha. Okay.
I have a related question. Sorry, I don't mean to keep derailing this, but there was a Slack conversation recently about the header that I think we used to have that would propagate identity of the caller to the application so that the services themselves could make authorization decisions. I think we had that header, and at some point we removed it. Is that something we would consider re-adding, or would we just tell people to use 2.11?
Yeah, I think, that would be, I think, a simple thing to re-add, but we don't want to add it by default because it's an information leak. So it's easy if you're running an ingress or an egress, something where you're not sanitizing these headers, it can be easy to start sending this kind of private data to external parties. And so we don't want it by default, but it would be pretty simple to opt into it. So I think that would actually be a pretty, I'm not gonna say easy, but a pretty tractable PR if someone wanted to do that work. We could probably help guide you through that.
Thanks.
Good first issue.
Well, maybe not first, but good second issue.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about what's coming up. Is any additional thoughts on the roadmap? Hopefully
you all do more of the typing than me. No, I think that we're going to keep investing in the extension work. So the first, maybe at a macro level, I don't think Linkerd's job is to do YAML templating. We have to do a lot of YAML templating to make things work, but that's really not what Linkerd is going to be the best project for. And so we're going to keep leaning more on Helm or what other tools are out there that can do these jobs better than we can. And so for now, that's Helm, and I think we'll see more investment in using Helm internally. And trying to, I think that might mean that the install becomes less easy, but simpler, where it's a little bit more predictable, but it's not everything just works out of the box. And yeah, we really want to focus on nailing the security story for Linkerd, right? And so Linkerd has to, I think we want to get to a place, I said this last year, where you can express policies like everything needs to be TLS'd. Even if the proxy is not doing TLS, we need to have TLS in everything. and we're getting there. It's not quite there yet, but you know, that's still the goal for 2021 is to get the pieces in place that you can express those policies in a coherent way.
Gotcha. Awesome. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left to go, and I think it is time to hand this over to Catherine for our Linkerd community hero.
Yes, so a lot of people participated, and so thanks for everyone who voted. And honestly, I mean, like Jamil, Richard, and Matt are all our heroes, but there is only one spot on the community page. So let's see who won. And let's make it a little drums here. And the winner is Richard, who is also on the call.
That's what you get for being on the call.
Yeah. And Richard has been super active on the Slack channel, helping his peers. And obviously the community really, really appreciates that. So really, really thank you, Richard, for doing this. That's really important. And congrats again.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Well deserved.
Yeah, we really do appreciate people who help other people, right? It makes our lives a lot easier if there's more voices kind of guiding people through the Linkerd experience.
I agree. I've been part of open source for the past, well, over a decade now. Although turning into a manager, it makes it less interactive often, but I still try to be as active as possible, and it just feels natural trying to help people.
We appreciate it. Keep it up.
Will do.
You're muted, Charles.
There we go. That's why my questions weren't being answered. So this is just standard Linkerd stuff slides. If you're here, you're already part of the community. I would say just tell your friends, let them know that you're using Linkerd and that it's awesome and that they should use it too. And with that, I think we can wrap this up. Any other final thoughts from William or Oliver or Catherine? All right.
Give us feedback on GitHub.
Thanks for the brain dump, Oliver. I appreciate it. And we will see you all in Slack and GitHub. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.